Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us as we go through the 2020 election results as we know them. I'm joined by NAFA's government relations colleagues, Maggie Beneo, Judy Carshrud, Julie Harrison, and Mike Hedge. Today, we're going to cover not only the federal races, we'll look at the presidential, the House and Senate races, as well as the state governors, state legislatures, insurance commissioners. We'll talk a little bit about our key wins and losses, and then we'll head into policy discussions regarding lame duck, policy issues that we expect early 2021. And then we'll talk about what it is that you can do and sort of the role that you can play in this process as we get started. Let's go ahead and take a look at the results. If you look, we started this process nearly 2 years ago. So it's been 2 years of campaigning. We started off with nearly 24 presidential candidates, and we ended up spending close to $14 billion, and that does not include the state races. As we exit the campaign, we ended very much like we began, and that's with a very divided nation. If you look at the White House, we see that it has flipped from a Republican to a Democrat. If you look in the Senate, even though we anticipate, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, Judy will touch on the Georgia races, that we still have 2 outstanding, but it looks like the Senate is going to hold its Republican majority, but the Democrats picked up a seat there. Then if you look at the House, where we know that the House will hold a Democratic majority, it's much narrower though. We saw that the Republicans so far have gained 9 additional seats. And then if you look at the state legislatures, Republicans picked up 2 there, and in the governors, the Republicans picked up 1. So there, I can get colorful in my language, and so I'm going to copy from my colleague Elena, thank you, yesterday for teaching me the word miffed and reminded me that that can be used. It looks like the electorate is a little miffed with our institutions if you look at how we ended up and where we are. Let's take a look at the next slide as we get into the president-elect. So if we talk about the president-elect, Joe Biden obviously was the vice president. He served in the Senate and in the House for a while. We know Joe Biden, and he's a legislator at heart. He knows how to cut a deal. He's pretty much a party centrist, and he's willing to compromise. And he retains a pretty optimistic view of the Republicans. So if you take that into consideration, let's talk about those that are willing to cut deals and take a look at the next slide. The top 3 leaders are also deal makers. And there's a good relationship between Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell, who we anticipate will be the Senate Majority Leader. And also with Nancy Pelosi and McConnell can work very closely together. So if you look at the 3 of them, their combined experience is 113 years. They know how to make a deal. They know how to negotiate. They tend to, have moderates in both of their parties that want progress. 2022 isn't that far off when you look at the numbers, and the margins in both the House and the Senate are really slim and at risk of flipping in 2022. It sort of suggests that there are opportunities there to work and get things done in the policy arena. But don't be mistaken, there are indeed challenges. There are inter-party fighting on both sides. The far right and the far left both want party purity, and they're going to push for it. And the challenge is going to be those that want to compromise are more likely going to face primary challenges. So they have to take that into consideration too, as they consider how they position on given policy and how hard they push or fight against compromise and negotiation. Let's take a look at the next slide, and we'll talk about part of the president-elect's transition team. He's starting to announce White House staff. And, while Joe Biden was clearly in the House and the Senate and has relationships there are 200 members of Congress who haven't worked with Biden previously. And so if you look at his selection of staff, particularly pay attention to Cedric Richmond. So Cedric has been chosen, he's a current congressman who's going to step down and join the White House. He was most recently put on Ways and Means, filling John Lewis's seat. He's going to serve as a senior advisor to the president as the director of the White House Office of Public Engagement. So Cedric is 47, and he tends to be a more moderate Democrat. And he's going to bridge sort of the gaps that you see with President-elect Biden with those new members of Congress that he hasn't worked with, perhaps bridging that age gap as well. So it'll be interesting to see how he works with Congress. Let's take a look at the regulatory agencies, though, because those are going to be really interesting. When you switch administrations, obviously the regulatory agencies change heads. And so we're starting to look at the various candidates that are being considered. And, we know some of these people as well. If you look at Roger Ferguson, stepped down as CEO of TIAA on Tuesday. So signaling that perhaps maybe there's more than just consideration there. And that would actually be really good for us. We obviously know him. He knows our industry. He knows our issues. So to serve as Secretary of Treasury would be really a good pick for the industry, I think. Let's take a look, though, because there's a whole host of people. There are other people that we know that could land in that position, too, that are being considered. And they know us and we know them. And we might have some differences of opinion, if you will. If you look at someone perhaps like Senator Warren, I don't know that we're always going to be at the same starting place. So that could be problematic for us. There could also be challenges there when you start looking at some of the senators, when you go back to the dynamics of having a sort of moderate president come in, as well as, push from the more progressives. Where is there going to be give? And in what agency is going to lean more to the right or more to the left? So we're watching all of that closely. The good news is that we do have relationships with all of these individuals, either through our immediate staff or through our larger team of outside consultants. And we're watching these and making sure that we have those conversations so that we continue a strong working relationship with the various agencies. Let's take a look at the next agency, though. So Secretary of Labor is also the Labor Department. Obviously, this is where we saw the fiduciary fight of years past, and we may see it again. Here, too, you'll see some familiar names. We obviously have a relationship with Representative Andy Levin. We know him well. Tom Perez and Seth both had time at the Department of Labor before. So we recognize those names. There are others that we don't know as well that are under consideration too. There's a whole slate though. Let's take a look at the second slate of individuals being considered for Secretary of Labor. We have Senator Bernie Sanders. Again, he sort of falls in the Elizabeth Warren category of senators that we've worked with that have had a different starting point than what NAFA has. So it makes it a little more challenging if you would have someone like Senator Sanders to serve in that role. But again, worked with him in the Senate, and we can work with him as Secretary of Labor should that come to pass. Let's take a look at the next agency. So Secretary of Health and Human Services. Here, we know obviously Representative Bass, and we know Governor Lujan Grisham used to be in the House, worked closely with her there, that are under consideration. They would obviously have jurisdiction over the health insurance issues that we care about. Let's move on. So if you look at the SEC, then there is the chair, Jay Clayton, just stepped down, which is customary to do when there's a change in the administration. But that means that someone else would have to be selected in order to chair the SEC. Here are some names, again, people that we know. Kara Stein worked in the Senate Banking Committee for years. We knew her there, knew when she moved over to join as one of the SEC commissioners. Also, Allison Lee worked for Kara at the SEC and held different positions before she became the SEC commissioner. And then Rob Jackson also, when he was at the SEC as a commissioner, we met with him several times. And so there's a relationship there. So again, people that we know, we'll wait to see who actually is selected and confirmed. Remember, it requires Senate confirmation for any of these individuals to take their positions, and that will be an interesting process too, especially since we don't really have a fully determined Senate yet. Let's go ahead to the next slide. I'm going to hand it over now to my colleague, Mike Hedge, who's going to run through some of the House races, and then we'll transition over to Senate races and state races in a moment. Mike?
Thanks, Diane. Excuse me. Most accepted logic, this year, both the presidency and the Senate would be tightly contested. Yet there seemed to be one safe bet when it came to the 2020 election results. The Democrats would easily hold on to their majority in the House of Representatives. Not only that, but that the conventional wisdom stated that Democrats would pick up more than the 235 they held in the chamber, which they'd won in the 2018 midterm elections. Now, some pollsters, such as The Economist, said that there was a less than a 1 in 100 chance the Democrats would have 221 seats or fewer in the next Congress. The chance they would get 225 or fewer was 1 in 100. So the odds were not looking good for Republicans. With just a handful of races still uncalled at this point, Republicans have gained 9 seats, having won 12 Democratic-held seats and lost just 3 of their own. And those numbers don't even tell the full story, given that 2 of the 3 seats Republicans lost were the direct result of a redrawing of North Carolina congressional districts that reworked the map in ways that were decidedly unfavorable to the GOP. Subtract those 2 seats, which neither party spent any money in or seriously contested, and you're down to a single competitive seat that went from red to blue, the suburban Atlanta 7th District. 2 weeks after the election, Democrats still haven't won a single one of the 27 House races that the Cook Political Report listed as a toss-up. That's an incredible stat when you think about it, especially when you consider that the Democratic presidential nominee won a 4 million plus popular vote margin at the top of the ticket. And especially when you factor in the predictions of House Democratic leaders and independent handicappers, the Democrats were poised to net double-digit seats and widen the majority. There's simply no way of spinning what happened to House Democrats on November 3rd. It was a bad, I'd say bordering on disastrous election, particularly when you consider that their majority will be quite narrow heading into Biden's first midterm election, which, if history holds, is a bad one for the incumbent party. Pelosi has taken responsibility for the victory in the House and stated that what matters is a continued Democratic control of the House of Representatives. Now, there's a parallel, a reverse parallel, if you will, that I draw from Newt Gingrich in 1998. If you recall, after Republicans impeached President Clinton, going into that election cycle of the midterms in 98, Republicans expected to pick up about 30 seats and instead lost 5, which Newt Gingrich resigned from Congress after that election and stepped down as leader of the Republican Caucus. We're not seeing that in the Democratic side at all. Now, what I'd say is one of the downsides as you look at this chart of new incumbents, or I should say new members, every 2 years, as a lobbyist or anyone with connections to legislators, the process of losing important and strong relationships with members and having to start the rebuilding process all over again, it gets personal at sometimes. You form these relationships with people. Take, for instance, Ben McAdams from Utah. He was a freshman congressman who unseated Mia Love in 2018 and replaced her on the House Financial Services Committee. Over the last 2 years, myself and others at NAFA have invested a large amount of time forming a strong relationship with him to add another ally on the insurance issues on the Financial Services Committee. I think back on Diane, Judy, and I first met him not even a week after he was sworn in at an event that we co-hosted at NAFA with ACLI. And then I had my last discussion with him about his upcoming race just 2 weeks before Election Day, and now he's gone. And at least for now. And the process of educating his successor and on all things insurance starts anew. This is another reason why you, as the members of NAFA and the volunteers, are so important to NAFA's advocacy efforts. If you have existing relationships with incoming legislators, there's a good chance that you're ahead of the curve, and that's why we rely so heavily on your input and efforts. On the flip side of that, Claudia Tenney from New York was elected back in 2016 and then lost her reelection bid in 2018. She's ran for reelection, or I should say for election again in 2020, And although the race seems to be undecided at this point, she's currently up by just over 2,000 votes. She was actually up by over 29,000 votes on election day, but you know, mail-in ballots and all that stuff this year. But you just never know when you might see an old friend come back into the fold, which is why relationships are so important. Slide, please. As Democratic losses continue to pile up in the House, Speaker Pelosi is preparing to lead what may be the slimmest House majority in nearly 2 decades, with little room to maneuver between its feuding progressive and moderate wings as she works to really try to deliver President-elect Biden's agenda. Pelosi appears to be on track to secure the vote she needs to line up the job in January. Some former opponents are lining up behind her, and other opponents that she had lost their seats in Congress. This upcoming Congress is looking likely to be the Democrats' thinnest margin since World War II. With a handful of races still to be called, Democrats are likely to control around 222 seats, effectively allowing no more than a few of their members to defect on any given vote. Progressives and moderates are already warring over how to use this dynamic to tip the party in their respective directions. For centrist Democrats, that will mean resisting the efforts of President Biden and other party leaders to push through more liberal policies. So things such as the Green New Deal might be more difficult in this Congress than they were previously. And it's interesting, some Democrats are actually pushing to change House rules to deprive Republicans of the ability to force uncomfortable votes that seek to put Democrats on the spot on such issues as socialism, police funding, sanctuary cities. It's uncertain if Pelosi will actually bless those changes, but the efforts reflect a recognition that Republicans, energized by their strength in numbers, are eager to try to drive wedges between Democrats. That being said, only 2 Democrats, Jared Golden of Maine and Representative Slotkin of Michigan, have said so far they will not vote to make her speaker. Of the 15 Democrats who opposed Pelosi 2 years ago, 4 lost, 1 is now a Republican, and at least 2 of them, Jim Cooper of Tennessee and Jason Crow of Colorado, are now saying they'll support her. Others, like Representative Schrader, appear open to joining or voting present to lower the total Pelosi needs, with only a few lawmakers outstanding. Democratic leaders, however, remain confident that they'll still have a unified support in their caucus, no matter the size, to pass a series of carefully negotiated bread and butter bills. I think they're going to really focus heavily on things such as prescription drug pricing, universal background checks for gun purchase and voting rights, easier stuff. Pelosi has dismissed claims of a progressive Freedom Caucus. That's kind of been the talk, the Freedom Caucus, which stifled the Boehner agenda so heavily when the Republicans had control under him. Pelosi saying there is no Freedom Caucus equivalent on the Democratic side, but the Progressive Caucus totals just under 100 members, which is about half of all Democrats in the House, or just underneath that. So we'll see how that plays out. It's going to be interesting, to say the least. Slide, please. Yesterday, actually, Democrats held their election for leadership on the caucus, and Nancy Pelosi was reelected as the leader, if you will, the speaker position, which she'll be up for in January. Steny Hoyer is leader again, and James Clyburn is the majority whip. Now, any kind of backlash there might have been, we didn't see any of that in terms of the caucus elections. Similarly, on the Republican side, there were no changes. Kevin McCarthy was reelected as leader, Steve Scalise's whip, and Liz Cheney was reelected to her position in the caucus. Slide, please. So this is an interesting one right here. As you can see on the slide, women, particularly Republican women, did quite well in the 2020 election. Women will gain at least 14 seats in the 117th Congress, setting a new record for female representation. In 2018, the nation elected 127 women, of which 48 were of color, and that was to the House and the Senate. Next January 3rd, at least 140 women will take seats, including 51 women of color. 8 races involving women have yet to be called, and those numbers could still grow. However, women will be at least 20% of the House this time around, and a strong showing by Republican women really helped drive that trend, with at least 36 serving in the next Congress compared to only 22 Republican women currently. Republican wins this year stood out, especially after the number of GOP women in the House dipped dramatically in 2018. That year, the ranks of Republican women in the lower chamber went from 23 to 13, while Democrats grew from 64 to 89. And this year, Republicans will have at least 27 women legislators in the House of Representatives. And this Republican gain wasn't an accident. Republican operatives worked hard this cycle to really boost women candidates, particularly in the primary level, where there hasn't been historically much support. On the Democratic side, they've used Emily's List, which has been integral to backing candidates at the primary stage of the race. And Republican organizations are now starting to replicate that model to really get them going. It's just common sense, I think. Without getting women through the primary, you can't expect them you cannot expect to get them through a general election. And it is interesting, if you look at on the slide, on the very bottom, the 3 first ever Korean American women elected to Congress, Young Kim and Michelle Park Steele, are both Republicans. And so 2 out of those 3 first-time Korean elected legislators to the federal House are Republicans from California. Slide. If you look at the committee makeup, the committees that really affect us, and I have 4 of them that I'm covering, there's not a lot of change on Ways and Means. You see that the Republicans lost 2 members, both to retirement, and on the Democratic side, at the very bottom of the list is Cedric Richmond, who Diane mentioned is taking a position with the Biden White House. So there's not a lot of turnover to be expected. We'll see how that shapes up. Slide, please. The House Financial Services Committee, there's quite a bit more, but even here, you look at the number of people that are not going to be on the committee next year. The only person who actually lost an re-election bid in the general election is Ben McAdams. And the Republican side, Scott Tipton and Denver Riggleman were both primaried out. On the Democratic side, Congressman Clay was primaried. Congressman Heck is now the Lieutenant Governor-elect of Washington. And Tulsi Gabbard, of course, ran for president unsuccessfully. But it's going to be interesting to see who filled those spaces, and there will be a lot of incoming freshmen who really look forward to getting a shot at financial services. Slide, please. House Committee on Energy and Commerce. This is a little bit different from really the other 4 committees I'm covering, just because on the Republican side, the Republican leader, Greg Walden, retired. And so 3 Republicans are actually vying for the top position spot on the committee. Those are Kathy McMorris Rodgers of Washington State, Michael Burgess of Texas, and Bob Latta of Ohio. McMorris Rodgers' pitch portrays her as a well-rounded choice to lead a large committee with broad jurisdiction. She served 6 years as House Republican Conference chairwoman, and she's well connected at the top of the caucus. So she's considered a favorite. She's also a very prolific fundraiser. And if she were to win that spot, it would make her the first top female leader for either party on that committee. Burgess is also very knowledgeable. He has seniority. He's the health subcommittee chair on that committee. And if Latta were to get it, there's a potential actually for 5 Ohio Republicans to top committees this Congress, depending how other elections turn out in this election process. The next ranking Republican on energy and commerce will become a leading voice in healthcare at a point where the party really has struggled to coalesce around a plan for replacing the 2010 law that the Trump administration is now looking at the Supreme Court to strike down, that being Obamacare, of course. So it'll be interesting what they really come up with on that side. There'll be a lot of influence in that position. Slide, please. Education and labor, kind of the same thing. You can see on here who's out. There are a few changes, 3 on the Republican, 2 on the Democratic side. It doesn't appear there'll be any leadership changes in the committee. And it will be interesting to see what happens in situations where DUL fiduciary could be something that comes back again with a new administration, and see what Congress comes up with this time around. But it'll really be a key point for all these legislators on this committee that are gone and are replaced by new legislators, really ensuring that we have strong relationships with those individuals on both sides of the aisle will be very important to move forward in the process of really rebuilding and establishing new relationships. Slide, please. And just on here, you see a congressional timeline. A couple of the days have already passed on here, but just for reference points, January 3rd, the 116th Congress concludes, and January 3rd, the 117th Congress is sworn in. So that's really when we're looking at the new Congress taking shape. And will be interesting to see what happens with committee chairs leading up to that process. And of course, January 6th, electoral votes get counted. And that's, I'm looking forward to everything that's going to happen. I make no promises on anything I've just said. So we'll see how it turns out. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Let's go to the next slide and we'll transition, and Judy Carshford will come on and talk about the Senate, which is really our unknown factor at this point with regards to leadership in the Senate and how that's going to dominate. And we'll then follow that with a discussion of policy too. Judy?
Yeah, so thanks, Diane, and thanks, Mike. I think you teed me up both with the word miffed and in the we really don't know until we get there. But the Senate is more staid than the House, certainly. A few flips. None of these are surprises. Mark Kelly, just likable in a lot of ways for Democrats, an astronaut. He's a twin. He's the husband of Gabby Gifford. John Hickenlooper, former governor of Colorado, also very much expected to take that seat. And Tommy Tuberville, and I'm just gonna whisper that he doesn't know what the three branches of government are. An easy win in Alabama. So little changes and nothing unexpected in the Senate with regard to the flips. And then Maggie, if you'll move forward one. The toss-ups, if you listen to our pre-election webinar, Danny Kehoe, one of our outside counsel, refused to make it an absolute prediction, but she did say that historically things go all one way or all the other. And certainly the toss-up seats in the Senate went all Republican. We're going to talk in just a second about the pending seats in Georgia, but McSally, McConnell, Collins, Cornyn, Daines, Tom Tillis, he had a little help from his candidate who is going to be in the encyclopedia of being stupid. All held their seats, and so the toss-ups that were really considered to be true toss-ups and that could have gone 100% the other way, to Danny's point, stayed all in one direction, and the Republicans held all of those seats. And so then we're left with what happens in Georgia. Georgia is what it all comes down to. Both Senate seats are in runoff elections January 5th. Tons of money being spent. As of today, it is $135 million on the runoff election campaign money being spent. Candidly, the Republicans are expected to win both of those seats, but as Mike pointed out, and the toss-up in the Senate seats have shown, the polls have been wrong before. Certainly Democrats are hoping that they both go. It is pretty well, analysts are really pretty solid saying that that these two seats will vote one way or the other, that it will not be a 51-49 version of the Senate, that it will be either both of these runoff elections go Republican or they both go Democrat. Gridlock is likely, with the Republicans expected to take both of those seats, and candidly in our industry and certainly in some schools of thoughts, gridlock is a good thing. And actually some of the campaign is being about make sure that there is gridlock and that the Democrats don't get the keys to the car and the credit card and and everything else that they need to go run crazy. So gridlock is likely in the Senate. And then in these runoffs, if we go next, Maggie, both likable candidates on both sides in both races. David Perdue has a little stuff on some ethics, but John is a really likable, and I think we'll see him again someplace. And in the Kelly Loeffler, Ralph Warnock race, again, both high profile, likable candidates. And so it will be, I think, just a pure party vote. And I've been saying, and I joke, but I actually don't think it's funny. I'm really glad I don't live in Georgia, because the amount of emails and advertising and whatnot that these folks are going to be subject to, because this will control the Senate. The majority, I shouldn't say control, it will be what the majority in the Senate is. And that of course controls the calendar, which is huge. And then we have to think a little bit about if McConnell is the majority leader again, a lot of his legacy has been achieved. And so what will he do with the last of this, assuming then that both of these races go Republican? He will have the majority, and he might have a new legacy. He is known for working well with President-elect Biden, and so the gridlock might actually allow some things that are very much in the center and where there is common ground to move forward. So with that, Maggie, help me. Oh, so yeah, the committee assignments and rosters, there are a couple of changes here in terms of people. I'm going to note, as Maggie, you can kind of fly through these slides. The chairman's change in a couple of the committees, but I don't think that will change the agenda much. And I would note that on these committees and the committee assignments, we're already experiencing both the age factor, with I think about 25% of the members of the Senate being what I would call really old, which is older than me by a lot, and the pandemic itself, and the need to either stay home because you're sick or stay home because you've been exposed and now need to quarantine, is affecting some of the operations in the Senate. But I think that the committees themselves are not likely to change very much, and we have great relationships in these with these folks, and will continue to be able to influence and I think help in the process once we get to the policies and the agendas, and where with such tight majority, you only need to find a few on one side or the other to change an issue, and that's where NAFA's strength is by far the best, because we have grassroots, we have this amazing PAC, and we have a lobbying team and coalition efforts that allow us to be able to get to the folks and persuade them on the basis of facts and information on any of our particular issues. So, and we'll get to issues in just a few minutes. So with that, back to Diane.
Yep, one more. Thanks, Judy. And on aging, we skipped over that. There really isn't any changes in the special committee on aging. You saw a couple of people who lost their seats, so we'll get a couple of new positions there. The aging committee is important when it comes to long-term care insurance. It's an advisory committee, and so those issues then flow back up to finance and the help committee for action on those items, but it's something that we watch too. Let's go ahead and we'll transition now to talk about the state governments, and I'll bring on Julie Harrison, who will run through how the states did after November.
Thanks, Diane. As you guys just heard about, the votes are in mostly, and they've been tallied, and the top line is really that not much has changed in terms of control in the state legislators. With nearly 6,000 legislative races in 44 different states. Really, the only big surprise is that only 2 chambers, the New Hampshire Senate and House, changed hands, and the GOP won both of those. New Hampshire is probably the nation's most like swingiest states, with one or both chambers flipping in 6 of the last 8 elections. So no huge surprise there. Going into the election, of all of the nation's state legislators, 52% were Republicans and 47% were Democrats. 82, which includes all 49 senators in Nebraska, were either independents or from a different party. And then there were 45 seats that were vacant. Also, before the 2020 elections, there were 36 state government trifectas, which happens when the same party controls both chambers and the governor's seats. Republicans at the time, just up until a couple weeks ago, had 21 trifectas, while Democrats had 15. Then the remaining 14 states had a divided government. In the 2020 elections, when the results came in, there were, right again, before the elections, there were 16 vulnerable trifectas, 8 for each party. And then there were 7 states where parties had the potential to gain a trifecta. So then when the results were coming in, ultimately Republicans were rewarded. They had flipped 2 divided governments to a trifecta, and those were in Montana and New Hampshire. Alaska still isn't official yet, but those could potentially be added to that list. It's important to note that Democrats have not held a majority of seats in the nation's legislature in the past 10 years. Sorry, I saw the slides were flipping a little bit. If we can move on to the governors. Thanks. So the 2020 elections, we only saw 11 governors races, and they, like the legislators this year, weren't a very major change agent. All of the incumbents won, and in 2 open seats, Montana and Utah, a win by the Republicans wasn't much of a big surprise. In Montana, the new governor-elect is Greg Gianforte, whose name I'm saying wrong, and the federal team will probably get upset with me because he is a former Republican congressman. He ran on his success as a successful businessman, and he campaigned saying he would bring a customer service environment to state agencies. He's pledged to reduce taxes and slash regulations for the industry. And it's just also a fun fact to point out that he was the congressman who made news in 2017 for assaulting a Guardian reporter, but he has taken a required anger management course. So that's settled. Then in Utah, the Lieutenant Governor Spencer Cox was elected to fill the top seat. And since we're doing fun facts, Cox is known for his active Twitter presence and for driving 200 miles a day to and from the state capitol rather than leaving his family farm. Politically, Cox has garnered a reputation as a moderate Republican who largely adheres to party policies while steering clear of far right-wing rhetoric. Next slide, please. Thanks. Voters in 5 states found insurance regulator races on their ballots. And those states were Washington, Montana, North Dakota, North Carolina, and Delaware. And all the incumbents won. In Montana, however, the incumbent insurance commissioner, Matt Rosendale, ran and won as a Republican for Montana's at-large congressional district. Elected to replace him is Troy Downing. Downing is a Big Sky businessman and Air Force veteran who campaigned on a small government, limited regulation Republican approach to the office. And I am aware that the NAFA state chapter there already has a good, solid, established relationship with him, which is fantastic. And then while I don't have a slide on this, I should note some of the ballot measure results. There were several health topics on ballots, including a lot of medical marijuana issues. Then in Colorado, people voted on a citizen initiative to establish a paid family and medical leave insurance program. And by doing this, Colorado has become the first state in the nation to do this through a ballot measure. Taxes were obviously another hot topic, and those votes broke in different directions, with voters in some states opting for higher taxes and in others choosing tax deductions. And here's just a short list of a few of these. There was a citizens initiative to reduce the state's income tax that passed in Colorado. Then there was an initiative to increase income taxes on those making more than $250K a year that passed in Arizona. The legislative effort in Illinois to remove the state's flat income tax rate failed. And then Arkansas approved the continuation of a 0.5% sales tax to fund transportation. Going forward, tax issues will continue to get a lot of attention. State budgets will obviously take up a lot of breath due to the pandemic and its impact on the economy. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about this later with the issues and policy, but just an example, Minnesota at this time last year, they had a budget surplus of $1.5 billion. And then when they reconvene in January, they're expected to have a $4.7 billion deficit. And then, however, on the other hand, in California, when it shut down most of its economy in the spring, the state legislature passed a spending plan that just assumed the worst. They raised taxes, cut spending, pulled from a post-recession savings account. And then it turns out people who lost their jobs didn't pay much in state income taxes anyways. And they were really the $20 an hour and less employees who worked at restaurants and theme parks. So instead of tax collection dropping the anticipated 15%, they are now up 9% compared to last year, meaning the state has quite a significant windfall in taxes, much more than they had anticipated. But even so, the deficit still looms. And while, better revenues than expected are fantastic, California and every other state is going to be facing major deficits and budget issues, which will result in tax bills. So, Diane, sorry if I got too much in the policy there. I digress.
You'll get to repeat it in a minute. We're gonna shift
I
over.
can't control myself.
It's so exciting. Let's go ahead and shift slides, and we'll go through those quickly. We're going to shift from sort of the election results, and Julie teed us up perfectly to start talking about the policy agenda. Let's take a look at the next slide. We'll talk first about what's going to occur in lame duck, and then we'll hit sort of the 2021 first 100 days agenda and what that might look like. So government funding, who wants to talk about whether we make that deadline or not?
Well, I think we make that deadline.
I think so.
If it's just a CR, I think we make that deadline.
No, I agree. And I think also on the list here, we have possible COVID relief. I think that's starting to peter out more so than not, but love to hear from Judy or Mike on sort of your thoughts there too.
So I don't know, Mike. What I'm hearing from the couple of meetings I've had this week with Republican members of the Ways and Means Committee, they are definitely hoping that that Speaker Pelosi will agree to something other than her full-blown proposal from May. And that we would get something done. Still a question mark sort of with where the Senate is, even with a smaller package, and even where President Trump is for any activity of any kind in lame duck. So I'm curious to hear what you think, but I know that there is a lot of will, if not a way, to get something done in lame duck on these things besides the funding.
Yeah, I think the smaller majority in the House for the Democrats coming up in the next Congress is actually a positive in terms of getting more funding done. I know that there were a number of Democrats that I'd spoken with before the election who were pretty frustrated about Nancy Pelosi not agreeing to get some kind of package deal through, considering President Trump had pitched some stuff to put through. The Republicans were willing to negotiate on certain areas, but she was very much sticking to her guns before the election of, unless it's the full package deal, we're just not going to do it. And I think those Democratic voices that were challenging leadership on the Democratic side and saying, we need to help provide benefit relief now, financial relief to people now and not in February. I think that with the smaller majority, there's a likelihood that Pelosi will be more likely to negotiate this time around. Now the election's over and Biden's seemingly won the election as president. I think that there will be less of a pullback from her side.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that there is even still in the Democrat thinking of we can do more later, right? But why not do something now?
Yeah, if it's not political, then you have to do it now, because there are people that do need the money now, and it's like, what are you going to do, right? You going to tell them to wait another 2 to 3 months?
You guys are so rational. I just hope that you're right. You know that I often suggest that Congress doesn't necessarily adopt rational thought in their actions. I think the calendar is working against them, but I hope that you're right in that we actually get something done there in lame duck. Health insurance is a question. I think that's a really big stretch. I don't see how we get that done, looking at the time frame that we have. Let's go ahead and flip, unless you guys have something else that you want to talk about in the lame duck activity. Let's look at 2021, and Julie, will bring you back in too to sort of talk about the issues, because I think they transcend both through the state legislatures as well as in Congress. We're going to see a number of the same issues. Let's go ahead and flip to the next deck and look at some of those. Retirement is certainly high on the list. We saw an introduction of a bipartisan, Secure 2.0, if you will, last month, and it looks really good. Judy, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so this is exciting legislation to further retirement savings proposals, employer-sponsored retirement savings proposals with tax credits for employers, savers credits for the participants, extending the required minimum distribution age from now 72 to 75. None of this has been scored. So when we get to the next bullet about tax reform, we're going to have to think about who pays for this stuff, because and in Mike's and my, like, maybe Pollyannish hope that we get another COVID bill in lame duck. Who's going to pay for all of that, right? And our industry is always going to be at the top of that. But the 2.0 secure legislation has a lot of really good stuff in it that we want, and it doesn't have the one provision that we were hoping wouldn't show up and hasn't, with respect to requiring employers, even small employers, to sponsor plans, which I think can be addressed a little bit with the multiple employer plan legislation of the original Secure Act, that will make it much, much easier for small businesses to offer plans, and those that don't are not offering them for very good business reasons, we hope. So yeah, I think that the retirement package, it introduced in the House, very bipartisan. Everybody on Ways and Means loves it, and is singing the praises of Chairman Richie Neal. And it overlaps very much with the Portman-Cardin bill in the Senate. So once the Senate takes it up and makes it their own, I think that then it can move. I don't see that happening in lame duck, but I do see it being something that Congress can do that is very much bipartisan and makes just a lot of good business sense in the.
Yeah, and I think that's an issue too, where our membership should pay attention. I think once we get into the new Congress, this is going to be something where we say it is bipartisan, but this is, to Judy's point when she was talking earlier about what NAPA does really well, let's go find those co-sponsors so we get those numbers up, and leadership, feels the pressure, if you will, to make sure that it's a priority and that it lands on the floors for votes, and we actually get this enacted, because I think there's a real opportunity there. Exactly, got to pay for things. So the tax reform's coming, right? So that's going to be an interesting little debate, and we'll certainly activate membership there, I believe. Let's talk a little bit, Judy, I know that you have some, and Mike too, on what the president-elect has proposed in the way of how he might want to change the tax code.
So I think we have to take his proposals with a small grain of salt, considering the narrow majority in the House and whatever direction the Senate goes, that he is going to have to stay very near all of the common ground. What can we all agree to? But there is going to be a lot of pressure. I think we've been talking about this since March or April with how does the government pay for this enormous, very necessary, in my opinion, personal opinion, spending that got done to sort of stave off the economic consequences of this pandemic. With viruses in the near future, I think that Congress is going to be even more motivated to address the spending and the deficits and any of even the Secure Act 2.0 version, how we pay for those things. And my sense and my joke has always been that we are the Sears Roebuck of revenue. People just flip the pages and go like, I like that on this page. I like that on this page. And all of the deferrals that are just inherent in our industry become pay-fors to offset that. And so I think we're going to be very busy educating early on the risks that our industry has just with the nature of our products.
Well, and I think that's a really good point too, that education component. If all they see is the dollar sign and not the value that our industry brings, it makes it really easy to pluck it out of the book, as you say, and put that into law. So it's incumbent upon us to make sure that they understand what those provisions do, why this industry is so important. And that's where we're going to want to leverage our membership as well and get you guys really active. Julie hit on this too, that, you know, the revenues in the states don't look so great either. And so I think we're going to continue to see tax bills in the states too that we'll want to watch and activate on. Julie, I don't know if you have any additional comments or if you want to.
No, not on the tax issue, but as mentioned, yeah.
Yeah, well, we can switch on too, because we'll move right on to the Family Medical Leave Act and the idea that we're going to expand and try to bring in some type of paid leave on parental leave, and making sure that our industry is understood that the short-term disability actually does provide a benefit. I think that's going to be key. Mike, I know you've been working on that a little bit.
Yeah, there's been a big push, even on the Republican side with the administration, on more accessible FMLA regulations and the inability to actually decline requests for that. I think it's one of those things. We submitted some comments on the issue along with other partners in the industry. I think as we move forward, there's going to be more outreach to the insurance industry just because of the expertise we have in it. On a lot of these different kinds of, whether it's short-term disability, long-term disability, there's been such an outreach from Congress looking for better direction through the industry. I think there's a good chance of getting something positive moving forward. And I don't want to put Julie on the spot, but I believe Colorado actually voted on FMLA during the November 3rd election. They were the only state to actually vote on it. I don't honestly know the outcome of that election, but I'd be curious if you did.
It did. It passed. Okay.
So there's definitely an appetite on both the Democratic and Republican sides to get something done in this because it's obviously beneficial. So I remain optimistic that the industry will be a big part of decisions moving forward as we try to find a better platform for everyone.
Yeah, let's move through. I'm watching the time and we're actually getting tight. I thought we had a bit more time than what we do. How about Reg BI? Let's talk about Reg BI and the interplay between the standard of care that never seems to end. Judy, you want to tee us off and then we can move to Julie to talk about what's going on in the States.
So you got so excited to talk about standard of care, the thing we wish we weren't talking about anymore that we'd already resolved like so many times. Yeah, so we are anticipating state activity at both at on the insurance side and the security side with respect to a standard of care, a best interest standard, a fiduciary standard. And we are working with our trade association partners to, and I can see your dog's tail wagging in the background just over your shoulder. So I just have to comment, that's so adorable. That we're anticipating and in advance thinking about how we educate the members of Congress to the degree that we might want Congress to intercede or act, and with Chairman stepping down away from the SEC, maybe a little more education at the SEC itself, and with FINRA to think about letting the new rule that has only been in place for 4 or 5 months play out and see that it did close the gap between suitability and a best interest standard. And that if there are tweaks that need to be made, we'll just tweak that, as opposed to states going off on their own and writing new rules, and having the DOL PTE on standard of care and third-party compensation in alignment with the Reg BI and the NAIC annuity model law, in alignment with Reg BI, so that the standard is the same no matter who you're working with or under what circumstance. If it's qualified money, if it's not qualified money, if it's securities, if it's insurance, the standard is the same, and that consumers then will know and will have the protections that they need to know what their roles and responsibilities are and what they can expect, with some disclosures on how they're engaging their advisors, and that then everyone would be able to have access to personalized advice. So our hope is that if we get in front of it, we can avoid something ugly that we have nixed in the past. So.
Yeah, we're getting tight on that. So Julie, I'm going to speak for you and say that we want the states to enact the NAIC annuity suitability amendments that have passed. And so we're going to work on that. Mike, real quick on the PRO Act tie-in, you and Julie, and actually Julie, I see you're unmuted. Go ahead and give us a rundown on what happened in California and hand it off to Mike, and then we're going to move over to Maggie quickly.
Sure. So the California situation, it happened towards the end of 2019 in AB 5, where they were trying to address the independent contractors, primarily targeting the gig type of employees for Uber and Lyft and all those different types of industries. But there was no exemption for the agents and brokers. It would have been detrimental to the agencies, to the industry, would have required our members to become, W-2 employees of every single carrier they were affiliated with. NAIFA California was very successful in getting the exemption for the industry, which, nipped that in the bud. But unfortunately, we are seeing some copycat pieces of legislation in some other states. It does sound promising that some of the states have decided they don't want to make the same mistakes that California has made and may exempt the industry from the very beginning. So fingers crossed that would be the case. If not, we'll have our hands full.
Yeah, on the federal side of things, we've been combating this since last year. And I think that even though they left out at the federal side the exclusion for the insurance industry, I haven't met a single Democrat who's not open to that perspective. It's just about getting them to actually include it. And so I think that with the continuing efforts we're doing, we're working with industry partners, really getting our strategy and ready for the next Congress. I would expect that regardless if it actually moves forward, and in no way Congress is looking right now, that wouldn't be a large possibility. I think at the very least, we could get a carve out for the insurance industry in there to really protect independent agents and the operational model that we have as an industry. So I think it's optimistic, even though it's, as it is right now, it's bad legislation.
Yeah, more for us to work on. And speaking
Exactly.
of more to work on, Maggie, tell us what our members can do too.
Diane, I'm going to try and speed through this for you guys just to be cognizant of your time, but we definitely have quite the slate of newly elected lawmakers. In Congress alone, we have 64 new members so far in the House and Senate. I say so far because we still have, as we talked about earlier, 3 seats pending runoffs. We have both the Purdue Ossoff race and the Loeffler Warnock race in Georgia. And then we have a Louisiana runoff between 2 Republican legislators. There are 4 races that are still also uncalled, 2 in California, and that one in California 25 I feel for because they just finished a special election. That's the seat that Congressman Garcia replaced Katie Hill, I want to say not 2 months ago, but in COVID land, I actually have no idea how long ago it was, just a brief period of time. In Iowa's 2nd district, last I checked, the difference between those 2 legislators is bound between less than 100 votes. So I think they're taking their time to make sure that they call that one correctly. And then Mike talked about it before, briefly, the race between a previous Congresswoman, Claudia Tenney, and current Congressman Anthony Brindisi. We also are going to see one special election in the future, at least, with Cedric Richmond going to the Biden administration, and likely more to come. You did see several senators, congressmen, things on Diane's list of potential chairs for regulatory agencies. And that's not even including any of the many other bodies that NAFA doesn't necessarily touch, but they could definitely be pulling from Congress for those. And so we'll have some more turnover in early 2021. In the state legislatures also, we have hundreds of new legislators across the country for you guys to start making friends with. And so we're building those relationships now. We are building them on the campaign level, and then we're building them now. So what are we doing to do that? The first one is debt retirement. We talked about this in the pre-election webinar, but particularly for members, for candidates who we weren't able to give to because of the SEC pay to play rule. We're hopefully giving them money now if they need it for debt retirement. Stephanie would be upset with me if I did not take this moment to remind you all that we're able to give for debt retirement because of all of your continued generous giving. So if you have not given to IFAPAC yet this year, or if you were planning on increasing your contribution to IFAPAC, now is a great time to do it because we're able to put that towards debt retirement and some early contributions in 2021. Our lobbyists are also having sort of lobbying meetings, obviously more virtual now than ever, but getting to know these new legislators. And then it comes down to you, and the relationships that you guys are building are really crucial. If you have a relationship with an existing lawmaker, somebody we might not already know about, or maybe it's a congressman that is now a senator, let us know at nafa.org/advocate. That's our Advocacy Action Center, and you can sort of plug all that information in right there and let us know. If you have a relationship with a newly elected lawmaker, you can email advocacy@nafa.org. Our Action Center will be updated with those lawmakers come January, but our system does not make the switch until the new legislatures start. So advocacy@nafa.org will be the place that you want to let us know about those relationships so that as soon as the legislatures start, we can leverage those. The other thing that you can do, if you are on any sort of social media, which I feel most people are, this is a great opportunity to sort of say congratulations and start a relationship or continue a relationship with either a candidate who won or a legislator who just won again their race. And so NAFA does have sort of some templates for you if you're interested, if you're not quite sure where to start, or you could do like our NAFA president-elected. He is our contact for Congressman Tom Suozzi, whose race was just called basically yesterday, maybe 2 days ago, and congratulate them with perhaps a picture and a short message if you already have a relationship. Either of these are great options. Just do what's comfortable for you on social media and get out there and thank your lawmakers. And with that, Diane, I hope I kept that short and sweet enough, and I'll turn it back to you.
No, that was beautiful. And I apologize that we ran a little long today, but Maggie's points are really important because what it is that you do is probably the most important. If we can switch to the next slide just real quickly there. It really does demonstrate it's the power of you, the power of us, and the power that you have is tremendous. But when each of you combine what you do together, that really creates that power of NAFA, along with our expanded team, both the professional lobbyists that we have on staff, as well as our outside counsel, all combining really does make a powerful force. We have a strategy to work with the new Congress, the new state legislatures, the governors and insurance commissioners. So we're good to go. We'll keep you posted as we sort of finalize the election results here and have new people. As Maggie said, our Action Center will switch over in January. You can report those relationships then or email us now. Get out there, get to know your lawmaker, whether you like them or you don't, they have a vote. And so you want them to be educated, and who better to do it than you? With that, we'll close it out. Thank you so much for giving us an additional 5 minutes of your time. Have a great day. Bye-bye.